The town buried Walter Greene on a cold Thursday morning. By sunset, everybody had disappeared except one woman standing beside the cemetery gate. I remember that day better than I remember what I had for breakfast yesterday. Maybe that's because nothing about it made sense. My name is Harold Bennett. I'm 78 years old now, and this happened almost 12 years ago in our little town of Millfield, Ohio. Walter Greene had lived there longer than most of us. He owned the hardware store on Main Street for nearly 40 years. Everybody knew him. Everybody shook his hand. Everybody showed up to his funeral. And yet by evening, after all those people had offered condolences and spoken about friendship, not a single one of them stayed. Except her. The woman wore a black coat and a black hat. I had never seen her before. She stood outside the cemetery gate without moving, just watching. I was helping fold chairs inside the church when Reverend Collins walked over. "Harold," he said quietly, "you know that woman?" I looked through the window. No. She asked where Walter was buried before the service. Something about the way he said it bothered me. "Family?" I asked. The Reverend shook his head. Not according to Walter's son. That was another problem. Walter's son, Richard Greene, hadn't spoken to his father in nearly 15 years. Yet suddenly he was in charge of everything. The funeral, the estate, the house, everything. As darkness settled in, I drove toward the cemetery on my way home. The woman was still there. I rolled down my window. "Ma'am, cemetery's closed." She looked at me. I'll never forget her face. Not because I recognized her, because she looked like she had been crying for days. Then she asked me a question. "Did they really bury him today?" I frowned. "What kind of question is that?" She glanced toward Walter's grave, then back at me. "They buried the wrong man." Before I could respond, she turned and walked away. Just like that. I sat there, stunned. The next morning I went straight to Walter's house. Sheriff Dale Mercer was parked outside. So was Richard. The two of them were arguing on the front porch. "You had no right," Richard snapped. The sheriff's face tightened. I had every right. Richard noticed me approaching and immediately stopped talking. That alone raised my suspicions. The sheriff pulled me aside. "Harold, did you happen to speak with anyone unusual yesterday?" I thought about the woman. For a moment, I almost told him. Then I noticed something in his hand. A photograph, old and faded. A picture of Walter standing beside a young woman. The same woman I had seen at the cemetery. The sheriff quickly slid the photograph into his jacket. Too late. I had already seen it. And when I asked who she was, Sheriff Mercer gave me an answer that chilled me. "That's exactly what we're trying to figure out." Then he looked toward Walter's house and added something even worse. "Because according to every record we have, that woman shouldn't even exist." The sheriff's words stayed with me all day. Not because they were strange, because Sheriff Mercer wasn't the kind of man who said things he couldn't prove. I followed him into town. At first he didn't want to talk. Then we stopped at the diner, and after making sure nobody was listening, he finally sat across from me. "That photograph was taken 32 years ago," he said. And the woman disappeared 6 months after it was taken. I felt my stomach tighten. "Missing person?" He nodded. "Name was Evelyn Brooks." The name meant nothing to me. "Was she related to Walter?" The sheriff rubbed his forehead. "That's the problem. Nobody can agree on what she was." That answer only created more questions. Before I could ask another one, the diner door opened. Richard Greene walked in. The moment he saw us together, his expression changed. He marched straight over. "What exactly are you telling him?" The sheriff stood up. "Sit down, Richard. I'm serious." The entire diner was watching now. Richard pointed at me. "My father died 2 days ago. Why are you digging through old stories?" The sheriff's voice stayed calm. "Because someone broke into your father's house last night. That got my attention." Richard looked shocked. Too shocked. "What?" "They went straight to Walter's office. Didn't touch anything else. Nobody spoke for a second. Then the sheriff added something important. They took photographs, old letters, family records. Richard's face turned pale. Not angry, afraid. A few hours later, I went to Walter's house myself. His daughter Susan was there. Unlike Richard, she'd stayed close to her father. She looked exhausted. When I mentioned the break-in, she lowered her voice. Dad was scared before he died. Scared of who? I don't know. She hesitated. Then she handed me a small notebook. I found this hidden in his desk. The notebook belonged to Walter. Most of it contained dates and reminders, normal things. But near the back, I found a single sentence written twice. If anything happens to me, tell Evelyn the truth. My heart started pounding. The same woman. The woman nobody could explain. The woman who supposedly vanished decades ago. Then Susan revealed something else. Richard came here 3 weeks before Dad died. That surprised me. The two men barely spoke. What happened? They argued. About what? I don't know. She looked toward the hallway. But I heard Dad say something. What? Her eyes filled with tears. He told Richard that the lie had gone on long enough. That night I couldn't sleep. Around midnight my phone rang. It was Sheriff Mercer. His voice sounded different. Urgent. Harold, I need you to come to Walter's property right now. What happened? We found something buried behind the barn. I got dressed and drove over immediately. 3 patrol cars were already there. The sheriff stood beside a freshly dug hole. He didn't say a word. He simply pointed down. Inside the hole was an old metal box, and lying on top of everything inside was a birth certificate. The name written on it wasn't Richard Greene. It wasn't Susan Greene. It wasn't even Walter Greene. The name was Evelyn Brooks. And under the section marked Mother, someone had written one name that changed everything. Margaret Greene, Walter's wife. By sunrise, half the town was talking about the birth certificate. The sheriff hadn't released the information, but secrets never stayed buried long in Millfield. Neither did rumors. Some people claimed Walter had another family. Others said Evelyn Brooks had been his daughter. A few insisted the whole thing was fake. But one thing was certain. Richard Greene was furious. The next afternoon, he stormed into the sheriff's office demanding answers. I happened to be there when it happened. You have no proof of anything, Richard shouted. Sheriff Mercer stayed calm. We have a birth certificate hidden in your father's property. That doesn't mean a thing. The sheriff leaned forward. Then why were you searching for it before we found it? Richard froze. Just for a second. But I saw it. The sheriff saw it too. And suddenly Richard turned around and walked out without another word. That was when I knew he was hiding something. Later that evening, Susan called me. She sounded scared. Harold, somebody was inside Dad's house again. I drove over immediately. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing except Walter's notebook. The same notebook where he'd written Evelyn's name. The sheriff arrived 20 minutes later. When Susan told him what was missing, his expression darkened. Who knew about that notebook? Susan looked at me, then at the sheriff. Only us. Nobody said what we were all thinking. That meant somebody close to the family was listening. The next day brought another shock. Reverend Collins asked me to meet him at the church. When I arrived, the mysterious woman was sitting alone in the last pew. The woman in black. For the first time, I saw her clearly. She looked older than I remembered. Late 60s maybe. Her eyes looked tired, like she'd carried something heavy for most of her life. The Reverend introduced us. Her hands trembled slightly. My name is Evelyn. Hearing her say it out loud sent a chill through me. I sat beside her. Why did you say they buried the wrong man? She looked toward the stained glass window. Because the Walter Greene I knew disappeared a long time ago. I waited, but she wouldn't explain. Instead, she opened her purse and handed me an old photograph. I nearly dropped it. It showed Walter, Margaret Greene, and a little girl around 5 years old. The girl was standing between them, like a daughter. On the back was a date from 37 years earlier, and 3 words written by hand. Our little Evelyn. My chest tightened. Everything we thought we knew was falling apart. Then Evelyn said something that made it worse. I came back because Walter promised he would finally tell the truth before he died. And did he? A tear rolled down her cheek. No. That night, Susan called again. This time she was crying. Harold, you need to come here. I rushed to Walter's house. The sheriff was already there. So were 2 deputies. Susan was sitting on the porch, shaking. On the table beside her was an envelope. Inside was a letter. Walter had written it just 3 days before his death. A final letter. A confession. But the last page was missing. Someone had torn it out. And according to the sheriff, only one person had entered the house before the letter was found. Richard Greene. Then Sheriff Mercer unfolded a second piece of paper they had discovered hidden inside the envelope. It contained only one sentence. 7 words that sent everyone into silence. Richard is not my son. That sentence hit like a hammer. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Susan looked like she couldn't breathe. The sheriff read the line again to make sure he hadn't made a mistake. But the words didn't change. Richard is not my son. The biggest shock came less than an hour later. Sheriff Mercer got a call from one of his deputies. They had found Richard. Not at his home, not at his office. He was trying to leave town. The deputies brought him back to the sheriff's office just before midnight. I was there when they walked him inside. Richard looked exhausted, defeated, like a man who knew he couldn't run anymore. The sheriff placed Walter's letter on the desk. Start talking. Richard said nothing. Then Sheriff Mercer pulled out the photograph of Walter, Margaret, and little Evelyn. Richard's face immediately changed. You knew about her, the sheriff said. Still no answer. Then Susan slammed both hands onto the desk. You let us bury Dad without saying a word. Richard finally looked at her. And what he said next changed everything. I was trying to protect Mom. The room went quiet. Sheriff Mercer leaned forward. Protect her from what? Richard closed his eyes. For a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he did. When I was 8 years old, I found adoption papers. Susan gasped. Richard nodded slowly. I wasn't Walter's son. I wasn't Margaret's son either. Nobody could believe it. But Richard wasn't finished. Mom told me never to ask questions. She said if Dad ever learned the truth, our family would be destroyed. The sheriff frowned. What truth? Richard's voice broke. Evelyn wasn't Walter's affair. He pointed toward the photograph. She was their daughter. The room seemed to spin. Everything suddenly started fitting together. The photograph, the birth certificate, the hidden records, the years of silence. Susan sank into a chair. If Evelyn was their daughter, then why did she disappear? Richard looked away, because he already knew, and he hated the answer. She didn't disappear. The sheriff stared at him. What? Richard swallowed hard. My mother gave her away. The words landed like a punch. Susan began crying immediately. Richard continued. Margaret became pregnant when she was very young. Walter and Margaret weren't married yet. Back then, they thought the scandal would ruin them. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Richard looked toward the floor. They told everyone the baby had died. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Because the truth was finally coming out. Instead, Margaret sent Evelyn to live with relatives in another state. Walter wanted her back. He fought about it for years. The sheriff opened Walter's confession letter again. Now it made sense. The guilt, the secrecy, the fear. Richard wiped his eyes. Before Dad died, he wanted to tell everyone the truth. He wanted Evelyn recognized as his daughter. Susan looked at him through tears. Then why stop him? Richard's face twisted with shame. Because he knew what came next. And none of us were prepared for it. I found out something Dad never knew. The sheriff stared at him. What? Richard looked directly at Susan, then at the door, then finally said the words that froze every person in the room. The person who arranged Evelyn's disappearance wasn't Margaret. He paused. It was someone who's still alive. The sheriff stood up so fast his chair nearly fell backward. Who? Richard looked sick. For years I'd seen him as angry, cold, selfish. But sitting there that night, he looked terrified. It was Reverend Collins's father. Nobody understood. Not at first. Susan shook her head. That's impossible. Richard nodded slowly. I found letters after Mom died. The sheriff demanded to see them. Richard explained that years ago Margaret had trusted the old Reverend, Samuel Collins, with her secret. Samuel wasn't the minister anymore. He'd been dead nearly 20 years. But back then, he had convinced Margaret that sending Evelyn away would save the family, save Walter's business, save their reputation, save everything. And once the lie started, nobody knew how to stop it. Walter spent years trying to find his daughter. Margaret spent years pretending she was gone forever. Then something even worse happened. Evelyn found them. 32 years earlier. The sheriff looked toward the photograph, the one with the little girl, the one labeled Our Little Evelyn. Richard nodded. That picture was taken after she came back. My heart pounded. Then why didn't she stay? Richard laughed bitterly. Because Mom refused. The room fell silent. She told Evelyn she wasn't welcome. Susan covered her mouth. Richard's eyes filled with tears. Dad wanted her to stay. Mom threatened to leave him if he brought her into the family. Suddenly Walter's entire life made sense. The guilt, the arguments, the fear, the notebook, the hidden records, everything. The sheriff immediately asked where Evelyn was. Nobody knew. Until the church doors opened. Every head turned. And there she was, the woman in black, Evelyn. She stepped inside slowly. Nobody had called her. Nobody had invited her. Yet somehow she knew. Susan stood first, then froze. Neither woman spoke. They simply looked at each other. Two sisters who had lived completely different lives. One raised by Walter, one abandoned. Richard couldn't even meet her eyes. Evelyn walked to the desk. The sheriff handed her Walter's confession. She read every page. When she finished, she pressed the papers against her chest. Tears rolled down her face. He tried, she whispered. Nobody answered, because everybody knew she was right. Walter had tried, far too late, but he had tried. Evelyn turned toward Richard. For a moment, I thought she might yell at him. Instead, she asked one question. Did he ever talk about me? Richard started crying. The kind of crying a man can't hide. He never stopped. Evelyn closed her eyes. Susan stepped forward carefully. Then another step, then one more. Neither woman knew what to say. There weren't enough words for 40 years of damage. Finally, Susan reached out her hand. Evelyn stared at it. The entire room seemed to stop breathing. Then Evelyn took her hand. And at that exact moment, Richard broke down completely. He buried his face in his hands and sobbed. Not for himself, not for the lies, not for the inheritance, for Walter, for all the years that had been lost. Evelyn looked toward Walter's confession one last time. Then she whispered something so quietly I barely heard it. Dad. And Susan pulled her into an embrace. If this story hit you hard, let me know in the comments what you would have done in his place. And if you believe family, trust, and dignity still matter, Subscribe for more real emotional stories like this one.